I've spent time recently with Dr. Redfield, who was the head of the CDC at the peak of the pandemic and transition between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and Dr. Dimitri Christakis, who is a pediatric epidemiologist who has been really studying the effects of the quarantine, the shutdown of the schools on young people. Both of them are talking about the profound effects that the quarantine and the shutting down of the schools is having on our school population now, and that the cost is practically immeasurable, but that it's going to cost, the model suggests, 5.3 million years of life lost for these kids in school now because their academic attainment is going to be less, which means their employment success is going to cost them an estimated $17 trillion for this generation across time. And so it's a big predictor of longevity. Depression is higher than it's ever been measured since we've been measuring it. Anxiety is higher. Suicidal ideation attempts and suicide is higher, particularly for young women, but also for men. So mental health adjustment is really bad right now, with depression and anxiety leading the problems, and tremendous academic frustration because there are these gaps now. So they're facing all of this expectation for work they can't do because anywhere from 5 to 12 months of loss is going to push them further and further behind. Is this kind of problem and frustration likely to create bigger problems going forward in terms of playing out in the schools with violence of this type or other types?
Yeah, I think we are at high risk right now. And, we've seen it play out over the last year with Oxford and with Uvalde, and even the Buffalo shooting and the Highland Park shooting. Both of those were 18-year-olds who had just been through the pandemic, being a, high school student during the pandemic. We're seeing, I think, risk factors, things like you've been mentioning, suicidality and hopelessness and depression, spending increasing times online. Those are all elevated because of the pandemic. And then you add into that record gun sales and just access within the home, that I do think we have to take this very seriously. We can't only talk about this after a school shooting occurs. We have to keep talking about it in building these prevention systems. I think so long we've been focused on reacting. It's about minimizing casualties and training ourselves to minimize casualties. We need to prevent this from actually occurring. And that's going to take some real training and resources and commitment from all of us in schools, as parents, as community members. But it's really time to start working on it.
Well, I'm really concerned because I know during that time, Department of Child and Family Service referrals were down as much as 40 to 60% because all of these mandated reporters, teachers, coaches, administrators, cafeteria workers, didn't have their eyes on these children. So they're just left to their own devices. We know that abuse didn't go down, but the referrals did. So it was happening, and these kids were suffering that. Certainly in these primary grades, you talk about these early childhood problems. So we now know that this was happening over these 18 months of shutdown. And for a lot of these kids, this is where they got their food. This is where they got their protection. This is where they had a sense of protection and community, and that was just taken away. You add to that their frustration with academics, and we've seen 1.3 million kids drop out of the public school system. Hell, in New York, enrollments dropped 9% just in New York City. So we've got a lot of kids really suffering right now. And then when I think about all y'all's research and everything it tells us that puts these kids on that path, it just makes it more urgent that we do what you've taught us we need to do?
The urgency is real because I think also our institutions feel so fragile right now. So the grievances that young people have, and they're on the internet searching for answers to their problems, we're at a time where we don't trust our institutions, we don't trust our schools, we don't trust scientists and journalists and politicians and police officers, and those that we usually would turn to for guidance and for the supports that we need to get through such a troubling time. And so as we become increasingly sort of polarized and as we become frustrated with the state of the world, that's also going to be underlining all of the other mental health challenges that we were just outlining. And so you have a kind of psychological component to this, and then you have this sociological component to it as well. And I think that for us is why we do need to really build those systems to prop up those institutions to make sure that they are there and they're functioning, particularly for our young people, because they really need them right now.
I think so too. We've got to do something to close this gap or it's going to get worse. That's something that's being worked on right now, but I don't think this one's over. I think we're going to see another one coming, and it's just going to put more and more pressure on our school kids. I think the work that you guys have done has just been prophetic and could not be more timely. Look at what we're facing now. Highest levels since records have been kept. We are at high risk. So we've got to dig in and figure this out. This is very high on my priority list. I visited Capitol Hill recently and talked to members on both sides of the aisle in the House and the Senate. They know that it's high on my priority list, and they're listening, and I'm hoping soon we might jointly go talk to some of these people and see if we can get something done. Is there a state, is there a school system, a region that you think does a better job, that is kind of a leader in getting some of this together? I know Colorado has some reporting systems and all. Is there somebody that you think approximates leading in the direction that needs to be done?
Yeah, Colorado has some really good systems in place. The organization Sandy Hook Promise has an anonymous reporting apps that about 2 million students use. And when they put in a concern, it goes to an actual crisis center and it's responded to within a minute by a crisis counselor who tries to sort of figure out what that student needs at the moment. And I think that's the type of model we really need at the national level. And the hopeful thing is, I think, when we've studied averted shootings or kids who are on this pathway and change their mind, sometimes the problem can feel so massive at the policy level, but it really comes down to a human connection, right? It's someone connecting with them, like you were describing, someone putting their hand around their shoulder, somebody giving them a little bit of hope to get them through that moment and to get them the resources that they need. So in some ways, that is incredibly hopeful because that is something that we can all be doing for each other every day.
Well, it's good that there are some examples out there, and we now have the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It's not flawless at this point because people are being trained, but it is up and it is running. It's the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It's got over 200 crisis centers that are open 24 hours a day. People sometimes can't remember the crisis prevention lifeline number, but they can remember 988. So that's out there, and it's getting more and more support and more activity all the time. I've been working with them on that and messaging on that. So we do have attention. People are paying attention to this on Capitol Hill. I hope you guys will continue to dialogue with me about this, and hopefully we can go up there and talk to these folks and see if we can get them to lean into it.
Absolutely.
We'd love to.
Yes.